Not any special one. There was an old girl that I was seeing quite often over there that
Inside a government vault marked classified, Elvis Presley left behind pages no one was meant to read, words written in his own hand, fears he never spoke aloud. The Federal Bureau of Investigation has just released them to the public, and what they reveal changes everything we thought we knew about his final years. He was not just a star fading under pressure. He believed someone was watching him and wanted him silenced. The file. Nobody was supposed to open. December 21st, 1970. A private jet lands in Washington. Elvis Presley steps off, alone. No entourage, no cameras waiting. He is headed somewhere nobody expects. The front gates of the White House. He carries a letter, 6 pages, handwritten on American Airlines stationery. He wrote it on the plane, somewhere over Texas, the words spilling out fast, urgent, almost desperate. He tells President Nixon that substances are destroying the country. He says hippies and the Black Panthers are a threat. He asks for one thing, a badge, federal authority. He wants to be made an agent at large for the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Substances. This is real. This meeting happened. The letter still exists, preserved today in the National Archives, one of the most requested documents in the entire collection. He arrived at the gates wearing a purple velvet suit and a cape, a gold belt buckle the size of a fist, sunglasses despite the gray December sky. Guards at the gate did not recognize the handwriting on the letter he handed over, but they recognized the face instantly. Within hours, he was inside the Oval Office, shaking hands with the President of the United States. What most people never learned is what came after. The FBI did not just shake his hand and send him home. They opened a file. They started watching. Not because Elvis was dangerous, because Elvis was useful. Declassified records show agents debating what to do with him. Some thought he was sincere, others thought he was naive, a celebrity playing soldier. But all of them agreed on one thing. His name carried weight, and weight could be used. By 1971, the file had grown thicker. Memos passed between offices in Memphis and Washington. Agents tracked who he spoke to. Agents noted his erratic behavior, his late-night calls to law enforcement contacts, his obsession with badges and weapons. One report describes him purchasing firearms at an alarming rate, sometimes buying several handguns in a single visit to a Memphis gun shop, often paying in cash, sometimes gifting them to friends within days. Another notes his fixation on joining federal task forces, as if a recording career was no longer enough. He wanted to be part of something bigger than the stage. The Bureau noticed, and the Bureau worried. Internal memos raise a different question. Was Elvis a help or a liability? He had access, he had influence. He could walk into rooms most informants could never reach. But he also talked. He bragged about his connections at parties. He told strangers he had clearance he did not have. He showed people badges that were honorary, not official, and let them believe otherwise. One associate later recalled him flashing a badge at a police checkpoint in Denver, waving officers off as if he outranked them. That contradiction sits at the center of the file. A man desperate to serve quietly, who could not stop telling the world about it. Read closely, the documents show something else. Fear, not of agents, not yet. Fear of irrelevance. By the early 70s, the music had changed. The British invasion had come and gone. Younger stars filled the charts. Elvis was still filling arenas, still topping bills in Las Vegas, but something had shifted underneath him. He was no longer the most dangerous man in music. He was an institution, and institutions get respected. They do not get worshipped the same way. The badge was never about narcotics. People close to him later described it differently. He needed purpose. He needed to matter outside of the sequin jumpsuits and the screaming crowds. Law enforcement gave him that. It gave him a role no audience could clap for, but one that felt, to him, more real. His personal physician at the time recalled him once saying he wanted to be remembered for more than songs, that he wanted to have actually done something. The FBI played along, carefully. They accepted his help on select matters, small things, nothing that risked exposure. They let him believe he was inside the circle. In return, they kept their own circle around him, watching, documenting, and filing. By 1972, the file included surveillance notes from associates who spoke to agents directly. Some were friends, some worked for him. They described a man who trusted easily and feared betrayal just as easily. A man who once handed out badges to friends like party favors, then grew suspicious when those same friends made decisions without him. One memo describes a phone call in which he asked an agent directly whether a former employee could be investigated, simply for taking a job with a rival promoter. This is where the story usually stops in most retellings. The badge, the handshake photo with Nixon, a strange, almost comic footnote in a glittering career. But the file kept growing. In 1973, an internal note flagged something unusual. Elvis had requested through an intermediary copies of any reports the Bureau held on members of his own staff. The request was denied. No explanation was given to him. But the denial itself, several who worked alongside him said, left a mark. He took it personally. He started to wonder, out loud, why an organization he had offered to serve would refuse to trust him with so little in return. That single denial planted something that would not surface fully for another year. A quiet resentment. A suspicion that the badge had given him access to nothing real at all. And what came next explains why that suspicion never stayed quiet for long. The voices he started hearing. By 1973, the man who once wanted to wear a badge had a different problem. He was afraid of the people closest to him. Court records from his divorce that year tell part of the story. Priscilla Presley described a husband who had changed. Mood swings, long stretches of isolation, nights spent awake while the rest of the house slept. The marriage ended quietly, on paper, filed in October. But the unraveling behind it had been loud for years. Declassified FBI material adds another layer. Agents had continued limited contact with him after the badge incident, mostly informal. But notes from this period describe a man growing erratic in his communications. He called federal offices directly, sometimes well past midnight, asking about threats he believed were forming around him. Agents who spoke with him described a pattern. He would mention a name, an associate, a stranger backstage. He would ask if the Bureau had information on them. Most of the time, the Bureau had nothing. There was nothing to find. This did not satisfy him. People inside his circle later confirmed what the file only hinted at. Elvis believed certain people wanted to use him, or worse, wanted to harm him. He grew suspicious of new hires. He questioned loyalty constantly. Bodyguards were told to report any unfamiliar face near the house on Highway 51. Visitors were screened twice before reaching him. This was not simple celebrity caution. Friends described something heavier, a growing belief that danger was close, even when no danger could be found. Doctors prescribing him medication during this period left their own paper trail, separate from the FBI file but consistent with it. Heavy sedation, sleep aids, stimulants to counter the sedation, a chemical loop that left him sharp 1 hour and foggy the next. Several people around him noticed his speech changing, slower, then suddenly fast, almost frantic when a subject caught his attention. The subject that caught his attention most often was surveillance. He told at least 2 associates, according to later interviews, that he believed his phones were tapped, not by enemies, by the government, the same government he had once asked to make him an agent. The irony was not lost on those around him, though nobody dared point it out to his face. This belief deepened through 1974. He began researching wiretapping equipment. He purchased devices meant to detect listening bugs. He swept his own home, room by room, convinced something had been planted. He once made his entire band wait nearly an hour before a rehearsal, while he checked the ceiling fixtures in the room. Nothing was ever found. Declassified files confirmed the Bureau's actual interest in him during this stretch was minimal. Routine background checks. Nothing resembling the close surveillance he feared. The contradiction is almost tragic. The man who once begged for a badge now believed the badge holders were against him. Friends close to him in Memphis described a ritual that became familiar. Late at night, after shows or quiet evenings at home, he would gather a small group and talk, sometimes for hours. The conversations circled back to control. Who controlled the music industry? Who controlled the government? Who ultimately controlled him? He spoke about historical assassinations often, Kennedy and King. He kept books about both men near his bed. He asked questions that unsettled people who loved him. Could it happen to him? Was he important enough? Was he dangerous to someone, somewhere, without knowing why? These were not the words of a man enjoying his fame. These were the words of a man bracing for something. By the end of 1974, the people around him had quietly adjusted their roles. Less management, more monitoring. Not of outside threats, but of him. Watching how much he slept, watching what he took and when. Watching for the moments his thoughts spiraled somewhere none of them could follow. The FBI file, for its part, stayed thin. A few more notes, a few more confirmations that nothing concerning was happening from their side. But that gap between what the file actually showed and what Elvis believed it showed became the most dangerous part of his final years. He was not being hunted. He believed he was, and belief, when it runs unchecked for long enough, can do more damage than anything real ever could. That brings us to 1975, the year everything changed. The year. The fear stopped staying quiet. 1975 opened with a hospital stay. Doctors admitted him on January the 8th, citing exhaustion and a liver condition tied to medication use. He stayed for nearly 3 weeks at Baptist Memorial Hospital in Memphis, in a room guarded around the clock. Staff described a patient who slept poorly, asked frequently about visitors, and wanted his bodyguards close even inside the hospital walls. Fear had followed him through the doors. When he returned home, something had shifted publicly too. Reporters noticed the change before fans did. His weight fluctuated, his face looked tired under the stage lights. Tabloids ran stories guessing at the cause. Few guessed correctly. Behind closed doors, the people around him watched a different battle. Not just physical decline, a widening gap between what was real and what he believed was happening to him. He began carrying a weapon more often, not for the stage, for himself. Associates later confirmed he kept firearms within reach in nearly every room of Graceland, including a nightstand drawer beside his bed and a hidden compartment near the piano. He told one friend he felt safer that way, watched but armed. The contradiction sharpened that spring. He still performed. In March, he opened a run of shows in Las Vegas that still filled rooms with thousands of fans screaming his name. On stage, nothing seemed wrong. He joked with the crowd. He sang with the same power that built his career. Offstage, the spiral continued, hidden from the cameras. A small circle knew the truth. His father, Vernon, grew increasingly worried, according to people who worked at Graceland during this period. Vernon began quietly managing more of the day-to-day decisions, stepping into a role he never wanted, simply because his son could no longer hold every piece together. Staff recalled Vernon personally reviewing medication deliveries that spring, something he had never done before. The FBI file from this year shows almost nothing new, a few administrative notes, confirmation that his earlier law enforcement connections had mostly gone cold. No active investigations, no real threats on file. Yet Elvis spoke to friends as if the opposite was true. He referenced government interest in his finances. He referenced concern about who controlled his image rights, his contracts, his future earnings. Business records do show real complexity here. Colonel Tom Parker's management deals were under scrutiny by people close to Elvis, worried the arrangements no longer served him fairly. That part was grounded in fact. Parker's commission, by some accounts, had crept toward 50% of certain deals, an arrangement far outside standard industry practice at the time. But Elvis folded it into something larger. In his mind, financial concern became surveillance. Business disputes became conspiracy. The line between a legitimate worry and a paranoid one kept blurring, and nobody close to him had the authority or the courage to draw it back clearly. By the fall of 1975, exhaustion had become the baseline, not the exception. Tour dates were rescheduled. A string of shows planned for September had to be shortened after he struggled to finish a performance in Detroit, leaving the stage early to scattered, confused applause. His voice, still remarkable when it cooperated, started to crack more often under pressure. Staff at Graceland began keeping closer notes themselves, almost mirroring the very surveillance Elvis feared, except this time the watching came from love, not threat. They tracked his medication, they tracked his moods. They tried to manage a decline they could see clearly, but could not stop. One nurse hired that. Fall kept a private log of his sleeping patterns, noting nights where he stayed awake until sunrise, pacing the upstairs hallway, talking to himself about people he believed were plotting against him. She showed the log to no one outside the house. It surfaced only years later, in interviews conducted long after his death. He was not being hunted by federal agents. He was being slowly consumed by a fear that had outgrown its original source. The badge he once wanted now meant nothing. The protection he once sought from the government had turned, in his mind, into the very thing he needed protection from. By December, he had grown distant from even his closest friends, speaking to fewer people, trusting fewer rooms in his own house. A small Christmas gathering that year was cut short when he excused himself early, telling guests he needed to check something, then disappearing upstairs for the rest of the night. Only 1 year remained before the story most people already know. The final months, the final shows, the final night. But to understand what happened next, you have to understand this. By the start of 1976, Elvis Presley was not afraid of losing his career. He was afraid of losing his mind. The Men Who Knew Too Much, July of 1976. 3 men walked out of Graceland for the last time. Not fans, not strangers. Bodyguards who had protected Elvis for nearly 2 decades. Red West, Sonny West, Dave Hebler. Fired in a single phone call, made not by Elvis himself, but by his father, Vernon, on his behalf, on the 12th of July. The official reason was cost-cutting. The real reason ran deeper, and it terrified the people who stayed behind. Red West had known Elvis since high school in Memphis. They had sat in the same hallways at Humes High School before any of this existed. Before the record deals, before the screaming crowds, before the White House meetings and the federal badges and the locked gates of Graceland. Red was there before all of it. He was not just hired muscle, he was memory. He was one of the last people alive who remembered Elvis before the weight of fame had reshaped everything about him. Losing Red West was not a personnel decision. It was an amputation. Sonny West, Red's cousin, had joined the circle shortly after. He was quieter than Red, but equally loyal, the kind of man who read a room before speaking and spoke only when it mattered. Dave Hebler came later, a karate expert brought in when security concerns escalated in the early 70s. Together, the 3 men formed the last ring of protection between Elvis and the world he had grown increasingly afraid of. According to those close to the situation, the firing came after months of growing tension over how the inner circle handled Elvis's condition. The men who were let go had grown vocal, not to the press, not to outsiders. Vocal internally, inside the walls, where loyalty was supposed to mean silence. They worried about the medication. They worried about the volume of prescriptions moving in and out of Graceland each month, quantities that several of them described, in later interviews, as genuinely alarming. They worried about his mental state, the sleepless nights, the pacing, the conversations that circled back to the same fears. They worried specifically about how easily certain doctors said yes to whatever he asked for. Sonny West later confirmed he had confronted one physician directly that spring, asking bluntly why prescriptions kept arriving in such volume. The physician, according to Sonny, had no satisfying answer. Vocal concern, inside a circle built on loyalty and silence, became a liability. Elvis interpreted their worry as disloyalty. In his mind, questioning the doctors meant questioning him, and questioning him, in the world he had built inside those gates, was the one thing nobody was permitted to do. The phone call from Vernon came without warning. No meeting, no conversation, no chance to respond. Just a voice on the line delivering a decision already made. Within months, the 3 fired men did something that shook Graceland to its foundation. They began working on a book with journalist Steve Dunleavy. A book built not on rumor, but on years of first-hand access. Every room they had stood in, every conversation they had witnessed, every night they watched from the hallway while the man they served came apart one prescription at a time. The book would expose what really happened behind the gates, drug use and erratic behavior, the paranoia that had calcified into something unmanageable, the fear that had taken hold of a man the world still saw as untouchable, still celebrated as the king, still filling arenas with audiences who had no idea what waited off stage. Word of the book reached Elvis before it reached the public, sometime in the early months of 1977, through a mutual acquaintance who delivered the news in person. People in the house described his reaction in 3 stages. First, explosion, then silence. Then something they had not seen clearly before in him, something quieter and colder than anger. This was not paranoia about strangers anymore. This was not wiretaps in the ceiling or government agents monitoring phone lines. This was real. 3 men who had stood beside him for a combined total of nearly 40 years were preparing to tell the truth, in print, with their names attached to every word. And the truth was the one thing he had no strategy for. He reportedly told associates the book would destroy him. Not his career, him. The image he had spent 2 decades constructing, the one that kept the stage performer separate from the man unraveling behind it, was about to collapse in ink and paper and newsstands across the country. Lawyers were brought in, Memphis attorneys consulted, then attorneys from New York. Letters went back and forth, threatening legal action, demanding the manuscript be halted. The 3 men did not halt. They had seen too much to be stopped by letters this time. They had already been stopped by a phone call once. It had cost them their jobs and their loyalty to a man they still, by most accounts, genuinely loved. They were not stopping again. This is where the file and the fear finally converge. For years, Elvis had believed unseen forces were watching him, building a case against him, preparing to expose something. The FBI file showed almost nothing to support that fear. But here, finally, the threat was real. 3 men with first-hand knowledge, a publisher with a contract, a release date already circled on a calendar somewhere in New York. He had spent years afraid of the wrong enemy. Those closest to him said his behavior shifted again through the spring and summer of 1977. More isolation, longer stretches inside his bedroom with the curtains drawn, conversations that circled back, again and again, to betrayal, to what loyalty was supposed to mean, to how men he had hired, fed, protected, and traveled the world beside could turn what they knew into something for sale. He once asked a cousin, quietly, whether money could still fix it, whether the right number, offered privately, might make the manuscript disappear. It could not. Meanwhile, the shows continued because they always continued. A string of concert dates that summer took him through the South and the Midwest. Audiences still screaming, still reaching toward the stage, still believing the version of him they had always been sold. Backstage, staff described a man who moved through the motions of performance like someone going through a routine he no longer fully inhabited. The book, titled Elvis, What Happened, was scheduled for release in August of 1977. It reached shelves on the 21st of that month. By then, Elvis Presley had been dead for 5 days. He never read the public reaction. He never saw the debates about whether the book was an act of betrayal or an act of courage. He never knew whether the image he feared losing had survived the exposure or crumbled under it. He only lived through the dread of knowing it was coming, certain it would end something, unable to name exactly what. The men who knew too much were gone from the gates, but what they knew was already in motion. The last door he closed. August of 1977. Graceland sat heavy with heat and silence. Elvis Presley was scheduled to leave for another tour in 2 days. Portland, Maine was the first stop. Tickets had been sold, hotels had been booked, the band was ready. Nobody inside the house expected those 2 days to be his last. On the evening of the 15th, he visited his dentist, Dr. Lester Hoffman, for a routine appointment, a small, ordinary detail that would later stand out sharply against everything that followed. He returned to Graceland that night in reasonable spirits, according to staff who saw him come through the door. He ate, he talked. He seemed, by the modest standards of that final year, almost like himself. Later that night, he gathered a small group around him, his fiancée, Ginger Alden, his cousin Billy Smith, and Billy's wife Jo. A few others who drifted in and out of the ground floor rooms as the hours passed. He played racquetball with Billy in the early morning hours, something he still returned to when his body allowed it. Witnesses later said he moved between bursts of energy and long pauses to rest, leaning against the wall of the court, catching his breath in a way that took longer than it used to. At one point during the game, he stopped and said he felt tired. Billy later recalled that was unusual. Elvis rarely admitted fatigue out loud. Afterward, he sat at the piano in the music room. Nobody asked him to. He simply sat down and began to play, the way he always had in quiet moments, reaching for music the same way other people reached for conversation. He played gospel songs first, the ones rooted deepest in him, the ones from childhood in Tupelo, before any of the rest of it existed. Then he moved into something slower, unchained melody. His voice, worn as it was by that point, still found something in the room that night. People present later described it as one of those moments that feel ordinary until they are not. Nobody knew it was the last time. He asked for his nighttime medication shortly after. The routine had been in place for years by then, a carefully managed schedule of sedatives and sleep aids prepared by his personal physician's staff. A man who had once feared government surveillance now depended entirely on the people inside his own walls just to close his eyes. Ginger went to bed sometime after 4 in the morning. Elvis told her he was not ready to sleep yet. He kissed her goodnight and walked toward the bathroom at the far end of the master suite, carrying a small stack of books under his arm. One of them was a book about the Shroud of Turin, a study of faith, of the body, of what persists after death. Those close to him confirmed this was not new. In his final months, he had turned increasingly toward questions that music and fame and federal badges could never answer. He marked passages in religious texts. He wrote notes in margins. He asked friends, sometimes in the middle of ordinary conversations, what they believed happened after. Nobody in that house understood, that night, how close the answer was. He went into the bathroom. He sat down to read. The door stayed closed. Hours passed. Ginger woke in the early afternoon, sometime around 2 o'clock, and reached across the bed. The sheets beside her were cold. She called his name toward the bathroom. Silence came back. She called again. Still nothing. She opened the door. She found him on the floor, face down, his body already telling her what her mind refused to accept immediately. She screamed for help. The sound brought staff running from other parts of the house within seconds. Joe Esposito arrived first. He dropped to the floor and began chest compressions immediately, working with the focus of someone who had trained for exactly this moment and prayed he would never need it. He later said he knew within the first few seconds. But he kept going, because stopping felt like a decision nobody in that room had the right to make alone. Vernon Presley was told in the hallway outside the bedroom. Those present said he did not speak at first. He simply leaned against the wall and slid slowly toward the floor, one hand pressed flat against the wallpaper, as if trying to hold the house itself upright. Paramedics arrived within minutes, sirens audible through the walls of the house and across the grounds outside. They continued resuscitation efforts in the bedroom, then moved him to the ambulance, working through the drive to Baptist Memorial Hospital, the same building that had treated him 2.5 years earlier, when all of this had still felt like something that could be turned around. It could not be turned around. Doctors at Baptist Memorial worked on him for over 30 minutes after arrival. At 2:30 in the afternoon, on August the 16th, 1977, Elvis Aaron Presley was pronounced dead. He was 42 years old. The cause listed officially was cardiac arrhythmia. Later, toxicology and independent medical reviews told a more complete story. The combination of prescribed medications accumulated in his system over years had placed his heart under a burden it could no longer sustain. The same prescriptions that had kept him functional through tours and insomnia and fear had quietly, steadily done their damage. The men who tried to warn about those prescriptions had been fired 7 months earlier. Their book was sitting in a warehouse, waiting for its release date 3 weeks away. Outside the hospital, the city of Memphis began to change within the hour. Fans appeared on sidewalks with no clear plan, drawn by the news spreading through radios and television sets and phone calls between strangers. By evening, thousands stood outside the gates of Graceland in the August heat, holding flowers, holding photographs, holding nothing at all except the particular grief of losing someone you never met but somehow believed you knew. The FBI file closed with a short administrative memo. Subject deceased. No further action required. 50 years of pages, memos, surveillance notes, and internal debates reduced to a single closing line. He had spent years convinced the government was watching his every move. The file showed they had mostly moved on. The real watching, the kind that might have saved him, was left to the people inside the gates, and even they, in the end, could not watch closely enough. The last door he closed stayed closed, and the world on the other side of it has never quite made sense of what it lost. The file is open now. The truth is complicated. Elvis Presley was not brought down by enemies or government plots. He was worn down by fear, by silence, and by the people who found it easier to say yes than to say stop. There is always more behind the curtain than what the headlines ever tell you.